A Patriots Faith, Chapter 14. The following morning, after the group of pastors met again, with Carson and Paul in attendance, Cody Nighthorse adjourned the meeting. The pastors said their goodbyes and filed out of the small wooden church individually. After several minutes had passed, Paul and Carson remained alone with Cody Nighthorse and James Scanlon. Pastor Scanlon looked over at Cody, who nodded back to him. "Gentlemen," Pastor Scanlon started, "we need to pack up and be ready to move out." He paused as he looked at his watch. "We go at 1200 hours. That gives us 48 minutes to get ready." He looked up at Carson and Paul. "Where are we going?" Paul inquired. Pastor Scanlon looked to Cody Nighthorse. "We're going to fly down to Paw, West Virginia. We have a mutual friend down there who we want you boys to meet." Carson and Paul exchanged glances. It occurred to both men that there seemed to be more going on than was being communicated. Carson knew Pastor Scanlon well enough to know that something was off with him, that he seemed a little unsure of what he was saying and doing, a trait that Carson had never witnessed with Jim Scanlon before. Pastor Scanlon interjected, "We'll tell you more when we land." He glanced at his watch again. 45 minutes. Get ready to travel. We'll meet you at the truck directly." Paul nodded, and he and Carson walked out, heading up to the apartment to pack. Cody Nighthorse looked over at his friend with concern. "Are you sure about this, Jim?" he asked. Pastor Scanlon just nodded. Truth be told, he wasn't sure. He knew Carson for many years, and he trusted him completely. He was getting to know Paul and starting to trust him as well. However, there was much at stake, and James Scanlon was not a man who trusted easily or quickly. Trust had to be earned, and it had to come naturally, and that usually came over a period of time, if and when it ever came at all. There was just so much riding on the success of their efforts. They couldn't be too cautious. But at the same time, the need was great and immediate. If not Carson and Paul, then who? They had no time and no other solid prospects going forward. No, he thought. It had to be now, and it had to be these men. He looked up at Cody. He managed a forced smile. "It'll be fine, brother," he said. Cody glanced at his watch. "We better get ready to go ourselves," he said. The two men walked together out of the old church. When the small plane landed at the private airstrip near Paw, West Virginia, the men unboarded and headed toward a waiting van. Inside, seated behind the wheel, was Bryce Leonard. "Trust you boys had a good flight," he said, as he slipped the van into drive and sped off. He looked in the mirror at Jim Scanlon and said, "We should be at the church in about 15 minutes, preacher." Pastor Scanlon nodded and just turned to look out the window. Bryce gave Paul and Carson a curious look as he glanced back at them. He didn't want to say too much because he wasn't sure what, if anything, Pastors Scanlon and Nighthorse had shared with them. After a few minutes, Cody Nighthorse spoke. Carson, Paul, you boys are new with us, and I know we just met. He paused briefly. Pastor Scanlon thinks very highly of you both, and he assures me that we can trust you completely. That being said, I'd be lying to you if I told you I didn't have some reservations going forward. It's nothing personal, just years of learning the importance of prudence and caution in building relationships and allegiances. In what we're doing here, I found sometimes the hard way how important that is to our success. However, we are at a point where events have transpired which cause us to need to make certain moves immediately. He looked back at Pastor Scanlon. Jim feels, and so I have no choice but to trust his instinct, that our best move is to plug you guys into this thing full on. We are at war here, and we have suffered casualties in that war. As you know, we lost a couple of key people, most recently our man in Washington State last week. The man that we are meeting with today is Perry Hoskins. He's the pastor of a small church here in the mountains. He was instrumental in starting the Joshua Project with us. As he continued to speak, 2 black Suburbans came screaming around the corner headed toward them. The one in front passed the van on the left and pulled in front of it, boxing it in. Bryce Leonard called out, "We got trouble. 2 of them. We're boxed in. Hang on, I'm going to try to shake them." He skidded the van into a violent turn, almost flipping it on its side. The SUV behind locked up its brakes and narrowly missed hitting the rear of the van. The SUV in front skidded to a stop and turned around as well. Now, Bryce was driving the lead vehicle, with both Suburbans giving chase. Paul pulled his semi-automatic 12-gauge from his gear bag, inserted a magazine, and pulled back the charging handle. Carson pulled out his AR-15, and both men got into position by the rear doors. The Suburbans were right on the van's tail, mirroring its every move. Bryce called out again, "Those SUVs are more agile, less top-heavy than this old van. I don't think we're going to be able to shake them. And we're headed straight into town." He made eye contact with Carson as he said it. Just then, shots rang out from the passenger side of the lead SUV. 3 bullets pierced the rear doors of the van, narrowly missing Carson and Paul. Paul looked up to see Bryce Leonard looking at him in the mirror. Paul looked over at Carson and yelled out, "Hang on!" Then he looked back at Bryce and said, "Do it!" Bryce nodded, and he locked up the van's brakes. As it came screeching to a stop, the lead SUV locked up its brakes too, but couldn't stop in time before smashing into the rear of the van, pushing it forward and sideways in the road. When it came to rest, Paul and Carson exited the van through the side door, which was positioned facing away from the SUVs. Each came around a different end of the van simultaneously, with Bryce Leonard following Carson closely. Pastor Scanlon and Pastor Nighthorse each drew their sidearms and maneuvered into position, following Paul around to the street facing the SUVs. When Paul and Carson were at the driver's side of the van, which was sideways in the road and facing the SUVs head on, They noticed that the lead vehicle had sustained heavy damage and that the airbags had deployed. As they approached in formation, it was clear that the driver was dead behind the wheel. As the passenger was already exiting the Suburban, he had his sidearm drawn and staggered in a daze, bleeding from his forehead. Paul took aim and fired one shot from the 12-gauge, hitting and killing him. By this time, both team members from the second SUV were advancing on the van, exchanging shots with Carson, Paul, and Bryce. It was over in seconds, and all four aggressors were dead. The van was littered with bullets, and the windows were shot out, broken glass littering the street. Pastor Nighthorse jumped into the driver's seat and put the van in drive. The collision had driven the rear axle forward, and the wheel on the left was wedged into the fender well. It was clear that the van was going nowhere. Carson, Paul, and Bryce stood in a defensive position as Pastors Scanlon and Nighthorse moved the gear and luggage bags from the van to the second SUV, which was undamaged in the assault. Once the bags were stowed, the pastors got into the front seats of the Suburban, and Paul and Carson jumped into the rear seat. Bryce Leonard pulled a glass beer bottle filled with gasoline out of his backpack and twisted off the cap. He tore a piece of fabric from his shirt sleeve and rolled it up and stuffed it into the opening of the bottle. As he turned to head toward the waiting SUV, he lit the rag with his lighter and he tossed it into the van. A few seconds later, it exploded, bursting the van into flames. Bryce felt the percussion on his back from 20 yards away, where the Suburban was positioned waiting for him, as he jumped into the back seat. Pastor Nighthorse put the SUV into drive and matted the accelerator, spinning the rear wheels. The rear end of the Suburban started to slide to the side before Nighthorse leveled off on the gas, and the vehicle sped off at high speed.